And I thank those intrepid souls still here this afternoon. I'll try to go through this rapidly. I do believe, and I am personally committed to the proposition that Arctic security is going to grow as something we need to be concerned about as an organization. And there's opportunity, there's also danger. So it's my pleasure to introduce a draft report of the subcommittee. The title is NATO and the Security in the Arctic. The paper highlights the growing importance in the region. Today, I will highlight the following two central points as presented in the paper. One, the Arctic is a region of strategic importance to this alliance, and it will only get more so. Second, the shifting dynamics in the Arctic, primarily caused by climate change, will affect the Euro-Atlantic security profoundly. NATO must take cognizance and incorporate this rapidly changing region into our planning and encourage our allies to take concerted action to address the root cause of geophysical changes in the Arctic, namely climate change. During the Cold War, the Arctic was an area of strategic competition. Russian military assets present in the region, particularly Soviet nuclear submarines, made the region a central theater for potential military conflict. But the geostrategic significance of the Arctic was reduced with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the confrontation between NATO and Warsaw Bloc countries. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the region became more peaceful and cooperative zone and reflected by the creation of several multilateral spaces for dialogue. First and foremost among those is the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council is an important forum for discussion and plays a role in shaping policy. Stakeholders can coordinate sustainability efforts and manage issues pertaining to the region and Arctic states. Despite the role such multilateral organizations play in shaping dialogue, an international treaty governing the Arctic still does not exist. Nor does a binding Arctic governance system. This results both in flexibility and, one might argue, a degree of long-term uncertainty as well in dealing with regional challenges. Therefore, it may be prudent for stakeholders to consider strengthening those legal and regulatory frameworks in the Arctic. But this is not the topic of my report. We're here to focus more clearly on security issues related to our alliance. After the Cold War, Arctic states focused their dialogue on non-military security and, for example, environmental issues and issues pertaining to local populations. That emphasis continues today. However, in terms of strategic relevance, the High North has become a hot topic because, well, it is quite literally heating up. Indeed, the Arctic is the canary in the coal mine for climate change. The kind of climatic upheaval clearly underway here is a harbinger of where the rest of the planet may be headed. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Arctic is warming at twice the global rate and has been since 1980. The National Snow and Ice Data Center estimates over the last 30 years, Arctic sea ice mass has been reduced by 75%. According to latest reports, the Arctic could be largely ice-free by the late 2030s. That's 20 years from now. This will have consequences in faraway places and a direct impact on NATO allies. Climate change will also further exacerbate the effects of several non-military security issues, including migration, food security, access to fresh water, and could be highly detrimental to already fragile states. In the Arctic, melting ice and receding permafrost will increase access to the plentiful resources available in the Arctic region. Climate change also increases space for maritime traffic and the development of integrated land and marine transportation networks. The Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route offer shorter, faster, and more cost-effective commercial shipping options, shaving off as much as 6 days of travel time for Asian-originated shipping, saving, obviously, a great deal of money. The more exposed maritime environment has also uncovered many other natural resources, including the world's richest fishing stocks, which are in the Arctic. The Arctic also holds large oil and gas resources. For now and predictably into the foreseeable future, the high-risk, high-cost endeavor of extracting oil and natural gas reserves in the Arctic, 25% of the world's oil and gas reserves may be in the Arctic, limit exploitation at this time. Those natural resource opportunities resulting from the changing Arctic environment must be managed. And this is particularly important as the retreating ice will lead to increased human activity while woefully insufficient to deal with this shift. That is to say, we don't have the resources we need to protect shipping and human activity in the Arctic. There's a need to expand existing infrastructure, particularly search and rescue capabilities. That's why there's a new focus and deeper cooperation on sustainable development and coordinated technical efforts in the Arctic. Search and rescue collaboration and multilateral cooperation on science, innovation, and research tackle shared challenges and can promote coexistence in the region, obviously a preferred outcome for NATO. The High North is often characterized as an area of stability and cooperation, including with Russia. It is in the interest of all parties that this continue. However, competition for Arctic resources, as well as the presence of military assets, particularly Russia's expanded military footprint and activities in the High North, could transform the space once again into one of strategic and military rivalry. Overlapping territorial claims are also a potential challenge both to governance and collaboration in the region. The High North is still home to Russia's Northern Fleet, the largest part of Russia's Navy, and is central strategic resource base for Moscow. The region's significance is likely to increase for Russia. The Arctic's largest littoral state, by far, is of course Russia, and is central to increasing for Russia and the Russian economy in coming years. Russia does share priorities for the region common with members of the Arctic Council and other littoral states. Russia's Arctic strategy, set in 2008, highlights a concern for new security challenges caused by climate change, including increased human activity. The Arctic is of critical importance for Russia because of the region's relevance for its economic development and for its security. Therefore, one could argue that expanding its infrastructure in the region makes economic and security sense for Moscow. But there are certainly many questions about Russia's activities and intentions in the Arctic region. And after Russia's actions against Ukraine and Georgia, one wonders if or to what degree Russia remains committed to international law and multilateral agreements. A much more aggressive Russia enhances concerns that Moscow may be on the way to militarizing the Arctic once again. Russian military modernization, which ramped up in 2008, is a source of apprehension as it has since reopened a number of military facilities in the High North and plans to build 8 additional Yasin-class attack submarines for deployment. These vessels would add to the 33 other variants of offensive submarines, that is to say, offensive submarines, stationed at deep-water ports throughout the Arctic region. Increased capabilities in the Arctic enable Russia to project power or deny other actors access or control of various parts of the region more effectively, should they so choose. For now, the Russian military presence in the Arctic remains below what it was during the Cold War, and NATO has an interest in avoiding another arms race in the Arctic. The report has also a section on China's interest in the Arctic. The People's Republic of China, which became an observer to the Arctic Council in 2015 officially, and other non-Arctic littoral states such as India and Japan are increasingly interested and engaged in the high north. Members of the political committee did indeed raise China's interest in the Arctic during a visit last year. Senior Chinese officials told our delegation that the PRC is monitoring the evolving situation as it sees both opportunities through the shortening of sea routes between Asia and Europe and available Arctic resources and challenges, including the future potential flooding of vast coastal areas because of global ice melting. Beijing is certainly seeking to expand its influence in the region. Our delegation that visited the Yellow River Station in Ny-Ålesund on the Svalbard archipelago can appreciate the intense level of interest China is taking in the Arctic. They have a very large compound and delegation in that small scientific station. China has also expressed interest in Greenland, a very small populated island that the Chinese all of a sudden have expressed some interest in as it relates to both the Arctic and shipping lanes. It's possible that China's Arctic strategy will be integrated into its global maritime strategy. This raises questions for NATO. How would developing a NATO strategy for the region incorporate the perspectives and priorities of non-Arctic littoral states in parallel to the demonstrated level of engagement by other external international actors? Whether Russia is indeed militarizing the Arctic and what kind of response from NATO might be required, possibly by increasing the footprint of the alliance in the region, must be thoroughly evaluated by NATO. Members and allies are committed to improving security throughout the North Atlantic, including in the high north. NATO places a strong focus on improving comprehensive situational awareness and maritime security and posture. At the July 2016 Warsaw Summit, NATO made these priorities explicit. The question now is how. How does NATO implement the Warsaw decisions? While the 5 Arctic NATO allies highlight sovereignty as a central priority and aspire to resolve any maritime disputes through diplomacy and dialogue, they may have slightly different perspectives of Russia's intentions in the region and a possible role for the alliance as well. Some allies are concerned that a NATO presence in the high north could exacerbate tensions. But I would consider NATO engagement in the Arctic is not in itself a controversial matter. At the least, increasing situational awareness will be relevant to and support NATO's priorities for transatlantic security. In the conclusion of the report, I've put several, I think, modest proposals on the table for discussion. They are as follows. First, initiate dialogue and information exchange among NATO allies in the North Atlantic Council to provide allies with the latest assessments of the impact of climate change on the Arctic. Allies should be encouraged to enforce existing international climate agreements and pursue additional opportunities for multilateral cooperation on reducing greenhouse gas. Second, create an Arctic task force at NATO headquarters. That would be charged with A, identifying the security implications of climate change on the Arctic and littoral states. B, reviewing allied infrastructure needs in the region, particularly with regard to SAR and communication capabilities. And 3, analyzing Russia's changing military posture and operations in the region, as well as China's strategy in the high north and possible implications of security for the alliance in the Arctic. Third, develop a comprehensive Arctic strategy that generates consensus among allies on a joint alliance approach toward the region that also includes concrete goals and timelines. This final recommendation might be a topic of discussion for our committee, and I welcome feedback on the draft report ahead of the final presentation in the fall. Before I conclude, I want to thank Stefan Sachs and our research assistants, particularly Constant Hubert and Carmen Chapman, also Colin Davenport and Ed Rice and our staff, as well as the wonderful expert team at the Congressional Research Service. And with that, I look forward to hearing your reactions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Congressman. We have several interventions, and I'll start with Baroness Ramsey from the UK.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Congressman Connolly very much for an excellent report on what is currently an extremely important topic of security for NATO and for all of us. All of the proposals outlined in this paper are, we think, very sensible and we're very much in line with British policy on the region. We feel that the UK defence policy in the Arctic is a supportive one that respects the sovereign responsibility of our Arctic allies. The UK is engaged in the region through the Arctic Council, the Arctic Security Forces Round Table, and our strong bilateral relations with our NATO allies, the United States, Canada, Norway, Denmark, and so on. The Science and Technology Committee of the NATO PA have had, over the years recently, excellent reports on the Arctic, the high north. And for some of those, we have to thank our very sadly missed colleague from Canada, Pierre-Claude Nolin, whom we all miss very much. And he produced some excellent reports on the high north, and also under his auspices, the STC sent delegation to Canada and the high north, and we are going to do the same now, sadly without him, this year in September, we hope. We've also, from the Science and Technology Committee, gone to Alaska, again to look at the high north from a different viewpoint, that of the United States. In recent years, I think everyone has started to realize that the Arctic is a rapidly changing environment. But in Northern Europe, and perhaps I think also in North America, because of cultural history, the romance of the Northwest Passage has been what everybody's been concentrating on. But from a NATO security point of view, even more interesting and more concerning is the Northeast Passage, as this paper is making very, very clear. Not least because most of that coast only belongs to Russia, which gives it a powerful, powerful voice in what is going to be a strategically very important highway. And we really need to keep our eyes on the ball, so to speak, there. Now, we think this could best be achieved by a flexible approach from NATO. That's, in other words, NATO being ready to react and keeping itself ready and well informed and ready to act as any security implications start to develop in a way that needs to be taken action on. Because what we don't really want this to come at the expense of NATO's other commitments. There should be more things in getting ourselves ready and in a state of readiness to act if we need to. But again, we think this paper is an excellent step in the right direction for our policy on the Arctic.
I want to thank the Baroness for her gracious remarks, and I couldn't agree more. This is what we're advocating here, are common sense steps to prepare ourselves to be ready, not to, preemptively do anything provocative or otherwise, but we got to recognize this is changing. And as you point out, Baroness, if you look at this map, which is one of my favorite, the security concern leaps out at you. Who is the biggest landmass in this part of the world? And you don't need captions to tell you the answer. And of course, that presents automatically some potential challenges for us. We want to seek a cooperative regime, but when 25% of the oil and gas reserves in the world are in the Arctic, when there may not be any sea ice in the shipping season so that we can shave significant time off Asia to European and North American shipping routes and travel time, when there still aren't any agreements or treaties governing this part of the world, and where we still haven't settled the issue of continental shelf extensions and what does that mean in terms of sovereign claims, there is a recipe for real conflict, and especially with Russia's more aggressive posture and seeming buildup of military assets in its territory in the region. The prudent thing is for us to get ready, and you put it very well, and that's the point of this paper.
I also just wanted to point out, last year I attended an Arctic Circle conference in Reykjavik, Iceland, and one of the speakers was Nicola Sturgeon, and she was asked why she was there, and she pointed out that Scotland was closer to the Arctic than it was to London. So I'll just leave that comment. Our next speaker is Oyvind Halleraker from Norway.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the rapporteur, Jared Connolly, for an excellent report. And I'm very happy that NATO PI attributes great attention to the pertinent issue of the Arctic. I think our recent visit to Svalbard demonstrated both the challenges and the opportunity for the Arctic region and what this entailed for our security environment. And I'm happy to see these issues so well reflected in the report by the rapporteur. But I would like to make two comments. Firstly, the Arctic is truly a diverse region. It is true, as stated in paragraph 11, that areas in the Arctic are environmentally fragile and with extreme weather conditions, but not the whole of the Arctic. Half of the Norwegian coast is in the Arctic, and much of the Barents Sea and the Norwegian Sea have ice-free conditions all year. That do not differ much from the North Sea, and that's of course because of the Gulf Stream. Indeed, as presented to us in the Oslo seminar earlier this month, exploitation in part of these waters are both economically and environmentally viable with modern technology. Secondly, I would like to underline that the Arctic is an area governed by international law. Indeed, as stated in the report, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas do apply for the Arctic oceans. And the Polar Code of the IMO came into force in January this year. The 8 members of the Arctic Council have reached agreements on a number of issues, the latest on the scientific cooperation signed at the Arctic Council ministerial meeting on the 11th of May in Fairbanks, less than 1 month ago. The 5 Arctic coastal states have agreed to ban commercial fishing in the international waters of the central Arctic Ocean until certain conditions are met, including a better scientific knowledge about the area. Therefore, even though the Arctic is not governed by a single international treaty, such as the one for Antarctic, it does not make Arctic a lawless area. It could be interpreted from paragraph 8. Thank you.
Well said, and we didn't mean to suggest that, so we take the point and I think try to make sure the report clarifies that. I will, however, point out to you, not to quibble, but the United States formally is not a part of the law of the sea. We have never confirmed that treaty. And so a lot of UNCLOS governs what happens in the Arctic, and we're sort of kind of outside of that. And we are one of the 5 NATO Arctic members. So, I mean, it's not a trivial point that, unfortunately, the United States is a little bit outside the penumbra of the law of the sea, which I think makes some of the legal issues murkier than they otherwise would be if we were inside UNCLOS. But your point's very well taken, and thank you so much for the intervention. And I do want to tell you, it was a trip to Norway and Svalbard as a guest of your government that inspired me about this issue. I was just thunderstruck by what I saw in Svalbard, and really appreciate the offer of your government to educate this member of Congress. Thank you.
You're welcome back whenever you like.
And our next speaker is Guy Michel Chauveau from France.
Oui, merci Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais d'abord saluer bien sûr à mon tour la qualité du rapport, extrêmement complet et précis. La France non plus n'est pas un pays riverain de l'Arctique. Cependant, elle participe depuis 16 ans en qualité d'observateur au Forum de coopération intergouvernementale au Conseil de l'Arctique, ainsi qu'à plusieurs autres enceintes techniques et scientifiques. Et elle y promeut depuis des années le principe d'une responsabilisation accrue des États extérieurs à la zone boréale, co-responsables du développement durable de cet environnement unique et fragile, comme vous l'avez dit, monsieur le rapporteur. En vertu de leur souveraineté et de leur juridiction sur de larges portions de l'océan Arctique, vous l'avez dit, les 5 États limitrophes, donc États-Unis, Canada, Danemark, Norvège et Russie, sont en première ligne pour répondre à ces défis. Cependant, la nature et l'échelle des enjeux requièrent plus que jamais une plus grande coopération internationale. C'est donc une grande partie de votre rapport. Et en matière sécuritaire, donc, l'OTAN a un rôle à jouer. Nous saluons votre proposition, monsieur le rapporteur, d'initier un dialogue entre les alliés au sein du Conseil de l'Atlantique Nord avec la participation d'experts extérieurs afin de fournir aux pays membres les dernières évaluations de l'impact des changements climatiques sur l'Arctique. De même, la constitution d'un groupe de travail sur l'Arctique au siège de l'OTAN serait la bienvenue, ce qui pourrait peut-être déboucher sur des capacités de recherche et de sauvetage communes. En matière politique, l'Union européenne plaide pour que les États riverains trouvent un équilibre entre des intérêts économiques bien compris et le respect d'une zone fragile et sous tension. Cet équilibre est extrêmement important et il est au cœur, bien sûr, de notre stratégie pour l'Arctique, finalisée, vous l'avez rappelé, en juin 2016. Donc la France contribuera, dans le cadre de l'Union européenne et de l'OTAN, à ce qu'il soit respecté. Et vous le savez, c'est le sens de nos engagements communs pris lors de la COP 21, où l'Arctique a été identifié comme la sentinelle du changement climatique. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Merci.
Our next commentator is Liv Signet Navarset from Norway.
Thank you, Chair. I would also like to thank the rapporteur for the excellent and comprehensive draft report. As a Norwegian parliamentarian, I'm happy to note that NATO PA takes a keen interest in the development in the Arctic, as reflected in our visit into Svalbard and also the upcoming visit to Canada. And indeed, this report. I greatly support this development, as I truly believe that we as parliamentarians must have sound knowledge and awareness about this strategically important region that is experiencing the consequences of climate change more rapidly than anywhere else on our planet. I therefore support the suggestion by our rapporteur that there should be an information exchange among NATO allies in the North Atlantic Council. However, I am more hesitant to whether there is a need or benefit of NATO generating a consensus on a comprehensive Arctic strategy for the alliance. I'm uncertain what the goal of such a strategy should be and whether it would be in the interest of all member states to have such a strategy, bearing in mind the good and existing cooperation in the Arctic Council. Perhaps the rapporteur could elaborate on this issue a bit. As underlined in the report, the cooperation between all the Arctic states, not only the Arctic littoral states, is good and fruitful. The Arctic Council continued to develop its cooperation on a number of issues, including search and rescue. After the signing of the agreement in 2011, a number of search and rescue exercises, both tabletop and live exercises, have been conducted in the Arctic to improve the cooperation between the countries in case of an emergency situation at sea in the Arctic. The establishment of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum has also been important to improve this cooperation. However, when it comes to search and rescue capabilities, this is first and foremost a national responsibility. The international agreements in the Arctic does not add additional capabilities. It's only to ensure that we make the best use of the available resources. Finally, we must not forget the bilateral cooperation in the border regions, which complements the broader Arctic cooperation. As you know, Norway has good cooperation with Russia when it comes to search and rescue in the Barents Sea. I'm therefore a bit reluctant to the suggestion to develop a NATO capability in this regard. It is very important that we, in this important area, we certainly need a broad international cooperation. In the search and rescue area, it also must include Russia. That's very important for us, as we have a very good cooperation, and I think Arctic as a whole would profit that we, in this area, does not make only NATO work, but that we include the whole Arctic area. This is very important, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
I thank our colleague from Norway for her very thoughtful intervention. And perhaps the word comprehensive is misleading. In no way does this paper mean to suggest that NATO ought to come up with a strategy that supplants the role of the Arctic Council, nor for that matter supplants in any way or competes with the proper responsibility of Arctic countries in their responsibilities in the region. But we need to be candid that other things are happening that could, those clouds on the horizon could blow away, or they could become very serious storms. NATO has to, as a responsible body, take that into account and make appropriate plans. And right now, as the Baroness indicated, they're plans for answering, I think, mostly administrative questions, but get ourselves ready administratively in the event that we need to do more or choose to do more as a body. But the critical point you're making, I think we need to be clear about in the paper. In no way can we be supplanting the proper role of the Arctic countries. And I agree with you, final point, obviously we have to seek cooperation with Russia, and there already is cooperation, as you point out. We don't want that to change. And I think the paper does acknowledges Russian cooperation, and that so far they've been a good, by and large, Arctic Council member. We want to keep it that way if we can. But we have to take a cognizance of what else they're doing, though, and whether that has implications for NATO. We don't want to get caught flat-footed. We want to always be prepared, at least on the planning side.
Oyvind, did you want to comment directly on this?
Just a small comment, if you allow me. This brings us into another question, namely burden sharing in the alliance. And we always heard that Norway is NATO in the north. So to say we are covering the north flank so far, at least. And by that we are investing in 52 fighter planes. We are investing in 5 civilian Poseidon planes. We are investing in new submarines, and all this to cover this area on behalf of NATO, not only for Norway. So we see our role here as a very, very huge responsibility. Thank you.
My country can feel your pain.
Our next intervention is from Georgi Kandalaki of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly, for your very interesting presentation. As you know, in March of this year, President Putin and Prime Minister Medvedev went to Franz Josef Archipelago in the Arctic, together with the Defense Minister Shoigu. It was a demonstration of the intent in this region from Russia. The Russian military built their runway and so forth, and they also announced a large-scale drilling project of oil. And I just read accidentally that there has been a discussion of ways how could Russian oil companies, perhaps together with some Western and even American oil companies, sidestep the sanctions. And if you could give us your view on how that can develop and whether that precedent of sidestepping the sanctions has actually chances of materializing.
I believe that if there are those who sought to sidestep sanctions against Russia or even explore sidestepping sanctions against Russia, that may have been an interesting thought a few months ago. It is a much more difficult thought to contemplate today. I can only speak for myself and my perception of my colleagues in Congress, and I don't presume to speak for them. I don't see any appetite on the legislative branch in my government to lessen the sanctions. In fact, I've introduced a bill that I think may yet see the light of day that would impose new sanctions for any country that is found to be interfering with the free elections of, democracies like ours. And like many in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. So I see more sanctions coming, to be honest with you. And I would never support, and I would argue vigorously against any dilution of sanctions until Russian behavior is appreciably changed, especially with respect to Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, and here in Georgia.
Lord Hamilton, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to congratulate Gerald Connolly on this excellent report. I'd like to follow our Norwegian colleagues on the question of search and rescue. I went with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly to Greenland, and Greenland is the second largest island in the world, and the distances there are absolutely unbelievable. And there are pleasure cruises going round Greenland. This is a new, adventurous, exciting place to go. The only problem is the waters are uncharted. And these pleasure cruises are actually an accident waiting to happen. And there is no search and rescue capability. If anything happened to one of these, there would be nobody to come to their rescue. The previous speaker said it should be a national responsibility to provide for this. Well, to be quite honest, to ask Denmark to provide search and rescue facilities for Greenland would ruin the country. This has got, I think, to be a shared responsibility. And if we're going to have pleasure cruises going through the northwestern, northeastern passage, which may happen in time as well, there'll be even more uncharted waters, even more accidents waiting to happen. But the bill to provide search and rescue is going to be very, very large indeed.
I really appreciate the point you're making, Lord Hamilton, and I would say to our friends from Norway, while I think they have wonderful capability, it does not characterize the whole of the Arctic. And you put your finger on a great exemption. And when you talk about a cruise ship, you're talking about possibly a few thousand people, waters that are not charted, icebreakers that aren't there, and helicopter flights that are hours away, maybe for us, in terms of the site of an accident or incident. And that's what we're trying to highlight here. Can we, as an organization, should we, start to address the holes that exist in an increasingly utilized part of the world, whether it's exploration for natural resources or cruise traffic, now that the waters are more open to navigation. And you can ask yourself, when you talk about cruises in the Arctic, what could go wrong with that? So I think you put your finger on exactly the kind of vacuum we're worried about in terms of search and rescue. And the second point you made, which I think our Norwegian friends would recognize, which is, should it be, can it be more of a shared responsibility than it is right now? Because a lot of the burden does fall on our Norwegian allies.
I just wanted to comment that during our visit to Svalbard, we took a boat cruise, and I remember the crew gave us an elaborate presentation on the life jackets and how you put them on and how you attach them. What they didn't mention was that you can only survive for 3 minutes in that water. So search and rescue is definitely a
Yeah, those are
challenge.
called feel-good suits.
Yeah.
They make you
About
feel a
3
little bit
minutes.
better.
Leona Owsley from Canada.
Thank you very much. And while my question's not around search and rescue, I certainly do want to just chime in for a moment on that conversation because, of course, the landscape from Canada in terms of its exposure on the Arctic situation is quite broad, and our ability to cover that entire landmass for search and rescue is certainly proving a challenge, and we've even heard from our Coast Guard, please stop telling people that it's thawing up north because they're going up there and getting in trouble and we have to rescue them, and we just don't have the ability to do so. So we do need to have a broader conversation on how we might even address that aspect. But my question to you, if I could, outstanding report. Definitely a conversation we need to be having. I think the recommendations are fundamental, but what I understand is it's not a new conversation. And the role for NATO in its relationship with other organizations like the nation states and, of course, the Arctic Council, how do we get there from here? How do we change and translate this idea into a reality? And is there a role for the NATO PA to start looking at what the NATO role in the Arctic space might be? And how can we perhaps cooperate with the nations under the concern and, of course, the Arctic Council? So what's the next step? How do we get from the conversation to the execution? Thank you.
Well, adopt my report. That's really the key step. No, I think this report, I think the recent visit to Svalbard by NATO PA, I think have sparked or renewed an interest in this part of the world. And it is of great strategic importance. You can't ignore it. It's not a backwater anymore, if it ever was, and so we need to sort of feel our way through what is the role for NATO that doesn't supplant or conflict with the good work being done by the Arctic Council and the littoral states whose membership that's made of. But look, we have competitors and adversaries who are interested in this region. Russia being a member. China being a very aggressive and interested observer, way beyond what you might expect. Lord Hamilton, I think, talked about Greenland. China. Greenland, I think, has 50,000 people, total population. China wanted to build a town of 15,000. If they built several of those towns, Greenland would become Chinese. Not that hard. And why? What's their interest in this corner of the world? Well, we can, none of that needs to be hostile or inimical to our interests, but we would be, the prudent thing is for us to make sure we've got, a plan for going forward, a plan that coordinates intelligence information activity, that identifies some of the holes as this becomes a more active place. NATO perhaps can play a role in augmenting things like search and rescue. Maybe not. Maybe we decide we've identified the holes, but they're being met. I can tell you, my government could use a few icebreakers. I mean, we have real naval shortfalls in this part of the world. And it is alarming to me because as everything from cruises to, tanker and cargo ship traffic start to move, we're going to see the need for more capability in the region. So that's really all we're trying to do. We will certainly take the caveats from our Norwegian colleagues to heart in making sure we clarify not by any means in competition with or to conflict with the good work being done by the Arctic Council. And, oh, by the way, we count on and exhort the Russians to continue to cooperate and keep this a peaceful region where we can work it out together.
And I'm going to ask a final question. In the beginning of your presentation, you talked a great deal about climate change and some of the threats it faces in the Arctic. As we know, President Trump has not yet decided whether to sign the Paris Climate Agreement. My question is, does he have the last word, or does the U.S. Congress still have a say in this issue?
My friend likes to lance boils, doesn't he? There is a political debate between the two parties in the United States about the subject. There is not a raging debate in the scientific community about what is happening. The debate between the two parties will continue whether the president decides to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement or not. That will not be the final word because, look, the United States is made up of 50 states, the biggest of which is California, which is aggressively signing bilateral agreements with other countries to reduce their carbon footprint and to cooperate with other countries in the exchange of technology to do the same. So, this debate will continue. My hope is that it will ultimately be resolved, not so far away, with the United States, of course, joining the overwhelming international consensus. I would note that at this body, most of us who represent my country have supported the consensus about global warming and climate change and intend to continue to do so.
Thank you very much. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, I don't mind being put in the spot at all.
No, but we Europeans want to have a better understanding of how the U.S. system functions, and so thank you. Thank you very much to Congressman Connolly. It was an excellent report and a very good discussion. So this concludes the meeting of the Political Committee today. I'd like to thank all of you. I think it's been an excellent discussion all day. We've been constructive. We've had some lively exchanges, and I want to thank you all because remarkably we kept within schedule. We've even finished ahead of schedule. The full committee will next convene at our annual session in Bucharest, which will take place October 6th through 9th. Now, on behalf of the entire committee, I want to express our thanks to all of our guest speakers, our observers, to our hosts, especially from the Georgian Parliament. I think we all agree they've worked very hard to make this session a success. But as always, we have to give a special word of thanks to our interpreters, who, as usual, have performed marvelously throughout the day. And I think they deserve not only a round of applause, but a lot of good Georgian wine tonight. And then finally, I think all of us who have been in NATO PA over the years know how important the NATO PA Secretariat staff people are, because they're the ones who make all this happen and make us politicians look good. So I want to thank our committee coordinator, Karen Walker-Love, who has looked after us with charm and with efficiency. To our research assistants who have been taking notes, Matthew Lemke and Constant Hubert. And finally, my reliable right hand here, Stefan Sachs, who has always been depended upon. Thank you to all of you. So as of this, the committee stands adjourned. I look forward to seeing all of you at the reception tonight. Thank you.